Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Friends of the Dar, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It gives us a great pleasure at al-Athar al-Islamiyyah to welcome an important and distinguished scholar, Dr. Richard McClary. Dr. McClary received his doctorate entitled The Rum Seljuk Architecture of Anatolia, 1170 to 1220, from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland in 2015. Prior to that, he was awarded an MA in Islamic Art and Archaeology by the School of Oriental and African Studies, London University in 2011. He has lectured extensively on the topic of medieval Islamic architecture around the world and has conducted field work in India, Turkey, Central Asia, and the Middle East. In Edinburgh, he currently teaches third-year honor course entitled The Golden Age of Islamic Architecture, Masterpieces from Spain to India. Tonight, his lecture is of a city that is in the news almost every day, Mosul. Dr. McClary will discuss a building that stood the test of time for centuries, but was recently destroyed by the ignorance of ISIS. His lecture is entitled Remembering the Imam Yahya al-Qasim, Ibn al-Qasim, Mashhad, in Mosul. The square plan building was constructed at the cliff edge above the southern bank of the Tigris and the citadel of Mosul. It was the most richly ornamented medieval tomb. His study is a reassessment of the structure and its original context. And he might touch on the hypotheses regarding the original appearance of the tomb. He, on the other hand, will not say a single word about mobile phones. That's for me to say, and for you to turn off your mobile phones. And let's welcome Dr. Richard McClary.
Thank you, firstly, to Sheikh Hassan for inviting me here, and for everyone at Al-Sabah for being so welcoming and helpful, both in the process of getting and being here. I'd also like to thank Katie Marsh, who I'm sure many of you know or know of, who's allowed me to use a number of photographs she took at the site, without which this research really wouldn't have been possible at all, or would certainly have been a lot harder. So today I'm going to attempt to provide as full an account as possible of the Mashhad of Yahya ibn al-Qasim. The term Mashhad was used to describe Alid tombs by both al-Muqaddasi and Nasiri Khusro, and it was common for a Mashhad to be built on the site of a masjid, as was the case with the structure under discussion here. The square plan building, measuring just under 19 meters in height, was constructed, as you can see, on the cliff edge above the southern bank of the Tigris in Mosul in circa 637, so that's 1239. I'll try and stick with the common era dates from now on and make it a little easier. It was destroyed in an act of cultural terrorism by ISIS on the 23rd of July, 2014. The destruction of the building was but one manifestation of a far larger attempt to eradicate the medieval architecture of Mosul, both Christian and Muslim. And the aim here is to provide a reassessment of the structure and its regional context. And I'll present some new drawings I've done of it based on the limited extant images, and some hypotheses about its appearance. In addition, the wide-ranging sources of the formal and decorative elements of the building will be examined, so we can have a bit of a sense of the wider context beyond Mosul or even Iraq itself. It's a building that, although it's important and highly decorated, hadn't been studied at all really for the last century, and even when it was first published, it was on a fairly cursory manner. Mosul, or al-Mawsil, the confluence, is the place where the trade routes from Iran, Lower Iraq, and Syria converge, and it lies on the southern banks of the Tigris. The ruler of the city and the surrounding region for much of the first half of the 13th century was Badr ad-Din Lu'lu', a former Armenian slave who ruled as regent for the Zangids, and then, following the death of the last Atabeg, became the independent ruler of Mosul and the surrounding region, using the Turkish title Togul Tekin, meaning Falcon Prince. He was recognized by the Caliph al-Nasir in 1233, and there followed a cultural boom which only ended with his death in 1259. He's known to have been the patron of a large number of buildings, and the contemporary chronicler Ibn al-Athar comments on his reputation for kindness towards his subjects, upon whom he bestowed money. However, such a view must be tempered by the fact that Badr ad-Din Lu'lu was Ibn al-Athar's patron, so one must expect him to paint him in a somewhat generous light. He wisely recognized the authority of the Mongols in 1245 and supported their invasion of Mesopotamia, thus saving Mosul from the first wave of destructive attacks that struck most of the cities of the region. Shortly after his death, the citadel in Mosul was largely destroyed by the Mongols, led by Sundaghu, following their capture of the city in 1262. This was because his successor didn't have the good sense to side with the Mongols. Always a bad idea to side against the Mongols if you're ever a betting person. The Mashhad was located on the north edge of the citadel, and it's very close to the palace of Badr ad-Din, actually. If you can see on this old picture from 1919, the palace was right next to it, and Badr ad-Din's own tomb was right next to the building here. The unfortunately recently destroyed leaning minaret and al-Nuri Mosque is located here, just for some context, and here's the tomb right by the riverbank. It was originally the site of the Ibn Hamdan Mosque, founded before 949, and was subsequently converted into the al-Badriya Madrasa at the behest of Badr ad-Din Lu'lu'. It was for the Shafi'i madhab, and at some point before 1218, then the Mashhad of Yahya ibn al-Qasim was added in 1239. So it's a complex site of which only one element had survived into the modern era. There was an earthquake in Mosul at midday on the 25th Dhul-Qa'dah 623, so November 1226, which destroyed many buildings in the surrounding area, including the nearby citadel of Shahrazur. Such destruction, in part, may have been the reason for the construction of the Mashhad, and furthermore may suggest that the whole structure, rather than just the dated sarcophagus, was built in 1239. Such a view is supported by the stylistic evidence, such as the amount of glazed tile used on both the interior and exterior. Now, it was after the death of the last Zangid, Mahmud ibn Masud II, in 1234, that Badr ad-Din Lu'lu' introduced sarcophagi dedicated to various descendants of Ali into madrasas in Mosul, thus converting them to shrines. This also occurred at the Izziya and possibly the Nuriya and Nizamiya madrasas, among others. And the scholar Snelders has argued that he added them to the Sunni madrasas of Mosul as part of the social policy aimed at creating more general acceptance of Shi'ism amongst the primarily Muslim Sunni subjects. The argument that Badr ad-Din Lu'lu' himself was a Shia has been made since the medieval period, but Patton does not believe this was the case. And what Mosul did have was an important group of people who venerated the descendants of Ali and other important figures in the history of Islam. Now, he makes the important distinction between the Alids on one hand and the Shi'i on the other. The Alids, with lineage from Ali, had the associated prestige and privilege, but they were not necessarily Shi'i themselves. Now, the crucial point is that the majority of the Alids, despite their name, were likely to have been Sunni. And it's been argued that the Alids were accorded almost universal respect, while the Shiites were usually despised, if not persecuted, at this time. More recently, Stephanie Mulder has noted that the non-sectarian reverence for Alid shrines was a rare point of commonality, and one that has few parallels in the medieval Islamic world. the presence of followers of such a wide range of faiths, including Jacobite Christians, Sabians and Yazidis, indicate that the city was a more tolerant place than indicated by earlier scholars such as Patton. This more nuanced view of the situation suggests that the Mashhad was never intended as a specifically Shi'i shrine, but formed part of a policy initiated by Badr ad-Din Lulu to gain legitimacy and bolster support from across as wide a spectrum as possible of his subject population. The emergence of a common visual language across structures erected for different faiths speaks volumes for the peaceful coexistence of different confessions in Mosul at the time. With the loss of the building itself, it is the surviving drawings and photographs which now provide the evidence for the presence of craftsmen working at the highest register of technical ability for a prolific patron of religious and funerary architecture in Mosul in the middle of the 13th century. One of the earliest descriptions of the Mashhad is by Carsten Niebuhr, who lived from 1733 to 1815. In his Voyage en Arabie et en des autres pays circonvoisins, published in Amsterdam in 1776, he describes the madrasa of Lulu and the superb edifice for the tomb of Pasha ibn al-Qasim, also known as Abul Qasim, he said. He notes that the Christians regarded him as a great saint and know him as Jacha al-Esraqi. Thus, the full name is shown to have been known in composite, with the usage split between the Muslim and the Christian populations. Niebuhr goes on to describe the epigraphic band that ran around the interior as marble carved out and filled with lime plaster. This is most unusual for something of that period to go into that level of detail when travelling through these parts for European travellers. He also mentions another inscription in carved clay. He gives the correct orientation of the building and notes that because it does not face Mecca, it's suitable for Christians to use the Mashhad as well as Muslims. Niebuhr suggests that this misalignment was a mistake, stating il n'a pas été mis ainsi, meaning it was not put well, and marks the location on his map of the city. Niebuhr's account of the use of the Mashhad by both Christians and Muslims may be seen as evidence for the longevity and flexible use of such buildings. The Mashhad was documented by Ernst Hersfeld, who lived from 1879 to 1948, and his colleague Friedrich Sahra, who lived 1865 to 1945, during their first trip along the Tigris between October 1907 and March of 1908. It was subsequently photographed by Gertrude Bell, the British spy, scholar, explorer, and general definer of lines in this region, shall we leave it at that, in the spring of 1909 during her first journey through Mesopotamia. One of the photographs she took was of the entrance facade, was published in her book, published in 1911, called Amurath to Amurath. But Bell gives little detail about the building. In the text, she has little to say other than describing it as beautiful and noting the deeply undercut stone carving. So the most thorough published study of the building is in Sören Herzfeld's Archäologische Reise im Euphrat- und Tigris-Gebiet, which is a 4-volume set published in Berlin between 1911 and 1920. And in addition to their trip mentioned earlier in 1907, the research was conducted during their second trip to Mesopotamia in 1911. It's recorded that the restoration of the Mashhad in 1907 involved the addition of plaster to fill large cracks in the northwest and southeast portions of the ceiling inside, as the building had started to separate into 2 sections as a result of subsidence. Returning during the First World War, he noted the addition of the retaining bastion on the Tigris side in 1916. We can just see that. It's this large, massive structure here with some supports. Now, he gives the date of 1916 for the addition of this bastion, but the drawing that we saw at the very start is dated 1919 and doesn't have it, so it's not clear whether he's wrong on the dating or the drawing was worked up later. It was not until late 1964 that Roberto Pagliaro again surveyed the Mashhad in order to make a plan for further restoration and stabilization. At that point, he noticed that those large buttresses were performing no useful function, as they were not actually attached to the building and were in fact causing more harm because their weight of some 400 tons was starting to pull the building even further over the bank. So it's doing the opposite of what it was intended to. So not only had the structure split in two as the northeast half started to slip towards the edge of the cliff, there's also a small degree of movement in the opposite plane. So the Mashhad had experienced at least three major phases of reconstruction prior to 1964. And some more recent images show that another major restoration, including completely replastering the entire exterior, had occurred prior to its destruction, but this is not something that's in the published record. So much for the context and a brief history of the Mashhad. It's with the entrance facade that the analysis of the formal and decorative characteristics of the structure begins. The majority of the load-bearing structural elements were built using half-offset or common horizontal bond known as hal-washad, or tie and untie. The entrance facade is orientated on a line running at 134 degrees and facing northwest. Now, much of the original appearance remains unclear. Early photographs show a portico, which, while of some age, as you can see here on the left, obscured part of the left-hand blind niche. So it's blocking this companion panel to there. So it's clearly not part of the original phase of construction. The date isn't clear, though. It's almost certain that the entire portico was later, as there's an inscription on the base using the word tajdid, to renovate or restore. I'll turn now to the epigraphy of the building. There's quite a lot of inscriptions on it, only a few of which have been published before. A large stone epigraphic panel was set into the bottom of the wall beneath the tall, narrow-pointed arch, and that's, you can just see, located right here, bottom there. It's not visible in any images taken after 1980, so its whereabouts is not unknown, but unlike the rest of the building, it might actually survive, hopefully somewhere. It's 3 lines of script described by the great Swiss epigraphist Max van Bechem as being Ayyub Nashki, and he read it as follows, saying, "And al-Hasan ibn Ali al-Askari, the 11th Imam, our Lord and Master, heir of the proof, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, the 12th Imam, Lord of time, upon them be greetings of peace. The command for making this was issued by the pilgrim Ibrahim Ahmed al-Ashkari, who wished to draw near to God, to the Most High, and his Prophet, and to the members of his household. May God's greetings be upon them all." So now we know it's the name of a patron who's not the original patron of the building, but without a date, it's unclear when it was inserted into the building. The presence of the names of 2 of the 12 Imams on the slab, along with the lower band of epigraphy inside, which does feature some, and probably all of the 12 Imams, it's not completely documented, does indicate that there had been, perhaps later, a more overtly Shi'i characteristic given to the building than it initially had. The location of the slab doesn't allow for the companion slab that would have contained the names of the first 10 Imams, and suggests that it had to have been taken from another building and added later. There are 2 panels of epigraphy in the blind niches either side of the entrance, which have knotted tripartite kufik with foliated hastai tips, so the tips of the alif and the lam, with particularly elaborate decoration and the final letters of Allah. Each panel consists of 3 unglazed sections of irregular width, so as to not cut unduly through the letter forms. And that's these ones here. So you can see when they're planning the inscription band, they don't just have preset tiles that they add the lettering to, but they cut the tiles dependent on where the letter form is, so they don't cut any of the ligatures or keep it to a minimum. So on the left-hand inscription, the break between the second and third divides the tail of a noon and the end of meme, but the intention is clear, and it allows for the entirety of the final Allah, including the knotting of the hastai to be on one tile. So that's this particularly elaborate knot here and here. There are many arguments as to what the knotting is and how it can be interpreted. They're often based on very little indeed, but some can be read into it perhaps. This similar knotting can be seen on the bodies of apotropaic dragons featured on several buildings in the region attributed to Badr ad-Din Lu'lu. And one intact can be seen on the now lost Al-Khan gateway near Sinjar. And the motif is referred to as the pretzel knot or the Syrian knot by the scholar Girlix. So the use of a decorative motif in the epigraphy flanking the entrance of the Mashhad, which was identical to one used for dragon bodies on buildings patronized by Badr ad-Din Lu'lu, but of course non-religious buildings, suggests that some sort of apotropaic semiotic value may have transferred from the zoomorphic to the textual context, as in all cases the motif is associated with the entrance to a structure. The epigraphy in the two small panels is quite hard to read. The panel on the right is described as being the Bismillah by Van Berchem, and his brief note on the inscription, he makes no mention of the left-hand panel. Unfortunately, the extant images are not all very clear, and the reading of the final two words as al-Rahman al-Rahim is quite problematic. There is a ligature connecting the lam and the two different and oddly formed ha's, owing over the ra, and despite these orthographic liberties, Bismillah al-Rahman al-Rahim remains the most plausible reading. The unpublished left-hand panel, which is the one we can see here, also presents a number of difficulties, notably in its middle section, but the opening and closing words are clearer, and it appears to read, "That which is under the rule of our Lord is from God." Above and below the two epigraphic panels, there is a band of squares. All four bands alternated between turquoise glazed tiles and terracotta squares with intaglio patterns. These bands are recessed with a bevel, framed with a narrow band with a curvilinear pattern. The lower decorative panel below the epigraphic panel, as you can see here, is this section in here, is flanked by two engaged columns with these interesting sort of vase-shaped capitals. Now, above the right-hand niche, there was a larger, and at 2.5 meters, much longer band of unglazed epigraphy in cursive script in this case. Continued onto a corresponding panel on the other side, but even the earliest images show only a tiny corner section surviving, and more recently the rest of the void has been filled in with plaster. The background decoration consists of small square divisions. Unfortunately, the quality of the image doesn't allow for a greater detail, but it's square sections projecting and receding to give it a sort of almost like a sort of turned metal, machine metal look. The whole panel had a turquoise glazed border and was in turn surrounded by a wider terracotta border with a geometric pattern known locally as Zanjil. Now the text of this read, "This was ordered to be built for the sake of God the Almighty by the poor servant Lu'lu ibn Abd Allah." So we know this is the earliest of the named inscriptions on it. There are also two small epigraphic marble blocks set at irregular heights at the base of the door jambs. These are visible in this photo taken by Friedrich Zara, so that each one had 5 lines, the bottom 2 lines on the left being far too damaged to be readable. And described as a Mamluk Nask by Van Berchem, it read, "This is what has sought to renovate this noble presence, the slave of God, the pilgrim Ibrahim ibn Ali, the servant of the sacred presence." There were 3 main patterns employed on the entrance facade, the lower section of the tympanum of the central arch over the door, along with the lower, larger rectangular panels in the 2 blind pointed arches we saw either side. These can be seen as patterns defined by the scholar Bourgogne, who published in the late 19th century, his Series 7, in addition to Series 8 and Series 4. The curvilinear, densely patterned terracotta panels inserted into these panels give a sense of added depth and complexity to the overall composition, but unfortunately their specific details are not clear on the surviving photographs. There are 3 examples from inside the tomb described as filler ornaments, Verlungsornamentes, by Herzfeld, which he drew to illustrate the split palmette and crown motifs, and these show it far better than any of the surviving photographs do. The shapes included on the building a kite, diamond, rhombus, octagon, and 7-pointed star, as well as a triangle. Originally, the northeast facade, facing the Tigris, had 2 registers of blind niches flanking the central window, but these were blocked by the addition of those 2 large buttresses in the early 20th century I showed you earlier. In the middle of the facade, there was a rectangular window beneath a pointed arch, above which was a rectangular panel with geometric decoration, with inserts of curvilinear decoration, as you can see in this detail here. Only a small section survives. Just a simple representation of the part of a pattern that's depicted there. It consists of 2 opposing quarter repeats of a pattern with an isosceles plan. Strangely, Herzfeld and Sarah made no mention of this pattern, and Herzfeld's drawing includes a fictitious pattern that was never there, so he obviously lost that page of his notes and just decided to fill it in with something that looked right. Mercifully, we do have this one image that shows what was actually there. Early images show the remains of fragmentary iron grills, which I've included in the drawings, but which were lost by the early 20th century. If we move further around the building to the somewhat less glamorous southeast facade, it was articulated by 3 rectangular shallow recessed panels. The central one originally had a blind pointed arch over the window, seen here, and it had been bricked up by the time Herzfeld visited. But the arch remained visible inside. So, although it's not seen in the drawing from 1919, some sections are visible on the later photographs taken in the 1980s. This facade was formerly attached to another structure, possibly part of the lost Badriya Madrasa. And Herzfeld's plan shows 2 short walls projecting, which are now lost. Unfortunately, because of the low resolution of the available images, many of the patterns are hard to discern, but they appear to be very similar to the joint plugs inserted between the brickwork of the Muqarnas cells of the ceiling inside. Comparisons can also be made with the large square panels at the base of the minaret of that was recently destroyed, attached to the Al-Nuri, or Great Mosque, nearby, just outside in Mosul. Above the cuboid body, an octagonal zone of transition supported the 12-faceted roof of the Mashhad, as you can see here. I think we have another image. Yes, turn to the drawing. The pyramidal covering of the spectacular Muqarnas cell dome allowed for windows only in the base of this structure. The exterior skin of the roof was originally glazed, but no evidence of such an aesthetic remained at the time of destruction, largely because of the replastering. During the various phases of construction, tiles had been sort of taken off, removed, reattached in rather random order, and in completely non-original locations. And some of the photographs in the 1980s do show this. Now, the use of glazed tiles on the roof, along with the tripartite division of the external facades and the use of Muqarnas cells for the ceiling inside, represents a point of connection with the funerary architecture of the Khwarazm Shahs at Konya Agench in Central Asia, now in Turkmenistan, over 1,500 kilometers to the northeast. These shared features, seen across large areas and different political spheres of influence, demonstrates the wide diffusion of this type of funerary architecture in the first half of the 13th century, prior to the period of Mongol Ilkhanid rule. The earliest surviving images of the building show a jamur consisting of a series of superimposed balls crowned by a crescent at the apex of the roof, and it's likely, although impossible to be certain, that this was part of the original construction. If we move from the exterior of the Mashhad to the interior, it's clear that from the ground up, the finest materials were used for the construction of the building. The floor of the Mashhad consisted of marble slabs laid directly on the earth, and the instability of the ground on which the structure was built resulted in it having a very uneven floor surface. The building had retained the wooden sarcophagus commissioned by Badr ad-Din Lu'lu. It featured curvilinear carved patterns along with an inscription that gave the name of Yahya ibn al-Qasim and the date, as well as the name of the patron, with the historical part reading, "This is the grave of Yahya ibn al-Qasim ibn al-Hasan ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib. God's blessings over them all. May in the hope of his mercy by the poor servant, Lulu ibn Abdallah, protector of Muhammad in the year 637. Now, in addition to the sarcophagus, Zahra and Herzfeld note the presence of a small wooden box. And although no images survive showing it in situ, there are detailed drawings of two of the decorative panels from the chest. It's been argued recently, quite convincingly I believe, that because of the almost exact correlation in pattern, a wooden chest now in the David collection in Copenhagen, recently exhibited in New York in the Court and Cosmos Seljuk exhibition, is the chest which Zahra and Herzfeld saw, and was probably created at the same time as the cenotaph. If this hypothesis is indeed correct, it would make the chest the only surviving element associated with the building that we know of. Now, although the presence of a mihrab in a tomb is not unusual, it's uncommon for one to be split into two panels and set at right angles to each other in the corner of a square plan building. Although such an arrangement preserves the internal proportional integrity of the space, it's somewhat odd that it is not a single panel set in an angle at the corner of a non-Qibla oriented building. A very similar mihrab was also in the al-Nadin Mashhad in Mosul, and the type is referred to as a corner mihrab. The al-Nadin is another square plan Muqarnas cell-domed building that was destroyed on the same day. They're doing some work on that at the moment, so I haven't finished that research. The mihrab featured architectonic decoration with a pointed arch supported by low-relief bulbous capitals and columns decorated with curvilinear carving. Find a point. So you see you've got the columns here with bases and capitals, as well as a hanging lamp and candlesticks. So it's echoing the objects that would actually have been in place, as well as the architectural form of an arch, even though it's flat panels. The band of epigraphy that ran along the sides and across the top of the mihrab itself is not mentioned in any of the publications. It began with the Bismillah, followed by Quran 76, 7-9, and these are verses which refer to the servant of God's love for him. 76:8 is noteworthy for being one of only 5 verses in the Quran that refer to human love for Allah. A further small band of cursive epigraphy ran along the top of the mihrab that consisted of Quran 11:73. Given the alid nature of the person honoured in the Mashhad, it's not surprising there was a reference to the al-Bayt, the people of the house, at the nexus of devotional focus in the building. Deep carving of alabaster in several layers was employed in the building, most clearly in the band below this lower band of epigraphy, including over the top of the mihrab, seen here. So you've got this band of epigraphy that jumps up and this superb carving with a close-up detail there. This style of carving can be found in other examples of stonework in both Mosul and Aleppo, including both mosques and churches, and has been described as being a style that resembles contemporaneous woodwork. Now, in addition to the epigraphy around and above the mihrab, there were 2 long inscription bands running around the interior of the Mashhad. The lower band runs horizontally a meter above the floor, had white lettering. Now, although it looks like very complex inlay, what it actually is the letter forms carved out of the dark alabaster stone and then ground up gypsum lime filled in. So it creates the aesthetic of being very complex, but it's actually a relatively simple process. But if it works, hey, don't rock it. It's probably going to be a lot cheaper and quicker as well. Now, this view taken by Zahra shows the east corner of the Mashhad. Now, Van Berkem identified the inscription as Quran 76, 8-12, and the final part of the inscription includes a description of the rewards in paradise. Now, having never visited the structure, like myself, Van Berkem had no way of knowing what the rest of the inscription consisted of. Luckily, additional photographs have come to light, and we now know that it included names of at least some and probably all of the 12 Imams. The available images allow not only the translation of fragments of the text, but also an appreciation of just how intricate the work that went into this building was. This section here contains the name and title of Ali ibn Abi Talib, followed by Khadija, the first wife of the Prophet, and the second and possibly third Imams, and Khadija the greatest, and Hassan the chosen one, and Hussein the martyr. Other sections that have been photographed include the names of the fourth, fifth, and sixth Imams, Ali ibn Hussein Zayn al-Abidin, Muhammad ibn Ali al-Baqir, and Jafar ibn Muhammad al-Sadiq. Images of the mihrab show a portion of the band of epigraphy in place along the top and down the sides of half of the mihrab. Now, this highly developed inlay technique was one of the city's main artistic specialities at the time and bears remarkable similarities to the style, if not necessarily the scale and media, of the metalwork decoration for which Mosul was so justly famous. Such connections between the different media are particularly striking when the treatment of the hasselblad tips and split palmette leaves are examined. These particular treatment here, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with objects in this collection exhibiting these same motifs. The upper band of epigraphy, running immediately below the first tier of Muqarnas cells, consists of carved panels with guard bands above and below. These feature the same pattern as used for the border around the upper panels of epigraphy on the exterior, thus tying the interior and exterior aesthetics together somewhat. The large Nashki letterings on the upper band consist of the entirety of Surah 112, which, despite its brevity, was said by the Prophet Muhammad to be equal to 1/3 of the entire Quran. Following Bismillah, it reads, "Say he is God the One, God the Eternal, he begot no one, nor was he begotten. No one is comparable to him." Interesting, the Christians would worship in there, given that that's written there, but that's a whole other topic. The inscription also included a fragment of Quran 22:14, which refers to prayer, salat, and the payment of tax, zakat. The great Iraqi scholar al-Janabi describes the material into which the epigraphy was carved as a special type of bluish-grey marble, known as hilan. In contrast, people have described, based on photographs, that it's terracotta, but it clearly is a bluish-grey stone. Now, immediately above the upper band of epigraphy was a superb 8-tier decorative Muqarnas ceiling. It was one of the most notable features of the Yahya ibn al-Qasim Mashhad, yet no significant mention was made by Zahra and Herzfeld in their Reis, although the plan of the ceiling is included in the ground plan. It's clear that the Muqarnas ceiling was most innovative and the most technically challenging part of the structure to build. It does have a number of irregularities, but these are almost certainly a combination of shifts in the building and the process of building requiring constant adjustment to make sure it all actually met at the top. Here you can see a section of the ceiling that's fallen away. It shows the void with these wooden struts and structural members to support it all. So it has no structural role, it's purely decorative, but incredibly effective at that. It's got a number of incised blocks between the bricks located in here to increase the decorative potential, as well as inlaid sections of tile, coloured tile. Now, these are motifs that also occur at the Mengecek Ghazi tomb in Kamar of circa 1190 near Erzincan, nearly 500 kilometers north of Mosul. There are square glazed elements set into Muqarnas cells. Now, the form of these cells can be seen across the wider region, stretching from Sivas and Malatya to the north in Turkey, to Nakhchivan, Marga in Iran, and Baghdad to the south. And the same basic Muqarnas forms were used for different decorative and structural roles, including minaret balconies, mosque domes, and tomb ceilings. They are of a type that can be found across a number of different building typologies and at different scales over a large area during the 12th and 13th centuries. The right-hand reveal of the window overlooking the Tigris features a small arched panel. You can see there's a series of them stacked there. And this same technique is also seen in stone at the Al-Nadin shrine and also actually at the Mar Behnam monastery, also destroyed in the last few years. Now, the spandrels of the arch overlooking the Tigris, which is what this window is, feature small-scale examples of the same pattern employed on the outside. So again, the inside and the outside. Here you're getting a slightly larger repeat of the pattern on a smaller scale, as is on the outside of the building. So again, it's tying the inside and the outside together. I always vowed I would never write about buildings that I hadn't been to. I was just so angry that they blew it up that I broke my rule, but it's incredibly difficult to, when you haven't been inside, to work out which wall is which. But I think I've just about got as close an accurate feel as I can. Now, there's two types of walls, both facing each other. So there's the one with these stacked arches on one side with the arch window, and then one with rectangular panels on the other, and they both face each other. So again, it has an internal symmetry as well as an external symmetry. You can see, this is that wall again. You can see the building really has suffered with this major fissure opening up right in the middle of it. Repairs rarely fixed the form of the arches. They were just to stabilize the structure. Now, if we look at the other, so yes, here's just a detail of some of those panels. So again, this idea of a geometric pattern in relief, and then a much lower relief curvilinear vegetal pattern to give it a greater sense of light and dark and depth. As the light moves over it, it's going to cast different shadows. Take another example. So here you can see the two different aesthetics side by side. With the fissures going up one side and also up the other. So the building was falling into the river like this, but it was also separating that way. So one might argue it was on fairly borrowed time anyway, but doesn't justify what happened to it. Now that the form and decoration of the mausoleum have been described in hopefully not too much tedious detail, I'm going to try and place the building into the broader context of tombs in what can be described, not in the view of some nationalists perhaps, but at the time the wider Iranian world. The Mosul Mashhad fitted into a long tradition of brick-built funerary architecture, square plan, often with at least one facade featuring tripartite articulation. Thus, the central entrance was either flanked by windows or blind niches. So although no Muslim tombs survive in the Islamic world from before 862, the square plan, cubic form, are common to a wide array of Islamic funerary buildings, right back to the Samanid tomb in Bukhara, datable to circa 930 onwards. By the early 11th century, tall funerary monuments had been adopted as a means of expressing power, and the prominent location of the Mosul Mashhad, high on the cliff overlooking the Tigris, gave a greater sense of grandeur and verticality when viewed from afar that perhaps exceeded its actual physical dimensions. The basic typology consists of a square plan with a tripartite articulation of at least one facade. These are flanked by windows below double-centered pointed arches. In addition, most surviving tombs of this type feature conical or polyhedral roofs above the volumetric cubic body. And this type had become a prestige trope across a wide area in the early to mid-13th century. The use of glazed tile decoration, knotted Kufic epigraphy, square plan and elevated roof system can be seen across the Iranian world at its widest sense, from Sivas in Anatolia and Mosul in Iraq to Kunya Ergenç on the banks of the Oxus and Safed Buland at the very eastern end of the Fargana Valley at the foothills of the Pamirs and the Tian Shan. The wide diffusion of such buildings in the 13th century and the formal and stylistic commonalities across such a large area is a phenomenon that transcends dynastic, regional, and anachronistic nationalist approaches to the study of medieval Islamic architecture. And the vast scope of these type of buildings speaks to the mobility of the craftsmen and the decorative and formal aesthetic for which they were responsible. The tripartite division of the facade of a relatively small structure with a large window or door in the center is to be expected if you're going to have flanking windows. So there's an element of practicality. And for these reasons, there's a risk in trying to develop too deep a philosophical framework for understanding this form. It has been done, but it's not always reliable. And given the absence of any contemporary textual evidence, it's very hard to read these things into buildings. But such a tripartite division wasn't limited to the facade of tombs, and a similar form was seen on a much smaller scale on the high-relief carved panel above the mihrab, dated 1170, in the nearby Jami al-Nuri in Mosul. Luckily, that was removed from the building and preserved in the museum in Baghdad, or at least the last I heard it was still there. The Mashhad of Yahya ibn al-Qasim consists of an innovative blend of imported forms and materials, largely developed in Iran, with the indigenous, deeply undercut alabaster or marble carving and two-tone epigraphic inlay techniques for which Mosul was famed. A wide array of the finest materials were used by the craftsmen who built it, including carved wood, marble, alabaster, glazed tiles, and baked bricks. These materials were combined to create a politically motivated Mashhad of the finest quality for a major patron of architecture. Alas, now for the modern world. The building, almost alone among the medieval structures in the area, survived the Mongol invasions of the city, as well as the inherent instability of the ground and erosion of the cliff edge. It lasted for nearly 800 years, but alas was unable to resist the power of the explosive dynamite set off it by ISIS in 2014 as part of a much wider destruction program of both Christian, Muslim, and pre-Islamic sites under their control. After destruction, the site was eviscerated, with the rubble being pushed off the cliff edge to destroy what little may have remained and onto the banks of the Tigris below. Thank you.